One of the scariest things about working in the CVICU is taking care of post-op open heart patients who are pacemaker dependent. For those of you that don't know, these types of patients always come up with a temporary pacemaker. There's temporary pacemaker, which is a box generator that is attached to these wires, and it is basically firing, is sending signals, electronic signals to the heart, is pacing the heart because the heart's own pacemaker is not functioning correctly. So what happens in patients who are completely pacemaker dependent, and especially when they are asystole underneath, where they are essentially dead, absolutely dead underneath this pacemaker, which makes it scary because if something happens to this pacemaker and if it stops pacing, this patient is going to code and potentially die. That is why it's so scary when you have a patient who has absolutely no rhythm underneath their pacemaker, which I've had patients like this before, where you go to pause the pacemaker and when we check underlying rhythm to see what's underneath, you're looking up at the monitor and you pause the pacemaker and you're watching to see what happens during that pause, and you're seeing what the patient's own rhythm is doing. But the times when you pause that pacemaker and you're watching the screen, watching that patient's heart rhythm, and you see a long flat line, when you're pausing it, it makes your butt pucker really tight and really fast because you're hoping really fast, you're letting go of that button really quickly, like, and you're hoping that this generator is going to kick back in, which it should, and it typically always do. But it's a scary moment because you realize at that particular moment that that patient has absolutely no rhythm whatsoever underneath. And that kind of changes the game a little bit because you're going to protect that pacemaker at all costs. Typically we have another pacemaker generator in the room just in case something happens to that one. You want to make sure the connections of the pacemaker are on point, and they're tight, connected well, because the last thing you want, because sometimes, we drop these generators and sometimes they break around uh, the entrance of where these pacer wires go into, and sometimes they can slide out very easily. You don't want that to happen in this type of situation, because if something happens where those pacer wires slide out on accident for whatever reason and that stops pacing that patient is going to code. So you don't want that. So you have to show extra care, when it comes to and thinking ahead, thinking what you can do to make sure that nothing, absolutely nothing happens until this patient either regains their own intrinsic rhythm, or they ended up getting a permanent pacemaker. So, which happens sometimes. But until it happens, you do whatever in your power to make sure that nothing happens to that pacemaker, nothing happens to those wires, and you have extra batteries, whatever. You make sure the batteries are charged and all of that. You make sure that the clip to the pacer wires on the patient and everything very well. They're wrapped up tight. Nothing can happen. So, and not even really trying to get the patient up doing too much, because the last thing you want is something happen to those pacemaker wires, because it's going to be a bad situation. So that's one of the scariest things about working in the CVICU to me. And of course, there's many other things too, but that one in particular, that's one of those that it makes for a very nervous shift. But if you have any experience in the CVICU, and if you can think of anything else that is pretty scary to you, let me know in the comments. And remember, always put pride into your purpose.